Hey, how are you?
Hello.
How you feeling?
Yeah, you know, took a shower, so I look better.
You look good. Your hair looks good.
I know. Dress for how you feel, right?
Absolutely.
Wait, or how you want to feel. Just kidding.
You want to say hi or check up? You can say hello.
Hi, Rocky. How's it going, boy?
He says, I'm in trouble.
I am. That's what I tell people when I'm out in the community. But it's a meaningful project that a lot of us have went back to school for, have this vision, and I try not to think of it as we're late in the game, but it's good to be able to plan for one in this day and age.
Yeah.
To be able to have all these opportunities and everything. Every time when we meet somebody, they say, "Why are we not funding Hopi? Why does Hopi, you guys are the most researched people in all of the United States, even international, and so we know we have been there on our hands that's been going on for a long time." Yeah. So thank you.
Well, maybe this will move you forward and get you where you want to be. So, who else is coming?
We're super excited.
Good. Well, welcome.
Well, we hope so.
So I can't read the small print on everybody's names. So Melissa.
Selena's here. Hi, Selena.
Kalisagan.
Hey.
Hello from Alaska.
And then Laura, right? Hi, Laura. And
Hi,
Sam.
Laura.
And Jessica.
Hi, Jessica.
And then Harriet's on the phone, and Tim.
Hi, Harriet and Tim.
Hi.
And there's Art. Hello, Art.
Yep, there's Art, and Gloria's on the phone, and then I think Hoopa is connecting, if I'm right.
Good morning.
Good morning.
I'm here.
Hey, Art.
Hello, Art.
We can just barely hear you, Art.
Hello. I'm not talking, I'm listening.
Always a good position to have.
That's fine. We look forward to any wisdom you want to give us.
So we're missing the Pawnees.
Yeah, I don't see Matt on.
Should we go ahead and start?
Or Catherine. I don't see Catherine either. So, but yeah, we can go ahead and get started. All right.
Okay, I'm going to turn my video off.
Oh, I'm sorry. You know what? And I did need to do something really quick too, because
Although it's kind of nice to see everybody.
I know
hold on.
the change.
I know what I'm sorry. Oops.
And my audio.
Sean, do you prefer that we have our video on or off?
I'm not going to be able to see anybody anyway, so
Okay.
I don't think it matters. I know that my internet has been, we had a lot of problems yesterday where we lost internet. So if that hasn't happened today, it was our understanding that it was Comcast maintenance. If I do get, if you do lose me, I will try to get back on with my, using my mobile hotspot as fast as I can.
Okay.
But I know when we were having problems yesterday and the service was sketchy, the Zoom and GoToMeeting and all these other platforms were telling us to turn our video cameras off because it will help manage bandwidth and I think you'll have a better time seeing my presentation. So I think that's fine if everyone wants to turn their video off. And once we get to the discussion, of course, it'd be great then to turn them back on and see everybody's face.
Hey, Susan, I need you to do me a favor because you signed on first. Go over to Sean's name in the participant list, and you have to make him a
And
co-host.
kick me off.
Right.
Do what?
You have to go over to Sean's name in the participant list and click on more, and it should be an option to make him a co-host.
Oh, that was easy. Good.
Okay.
Made me nervous in front of all my friends.
Well, for me, that's what you get, you know.
So make host. Okay.
There you go.
Want to change the host to Sean? Yes.
Well,
Oh.
yeah.
I already hit it. Sorry.
It says I am the host now.
Now you can do everything, Sean.
Ha ha ha. Okay, should we get started?
Go for it.
Okay, I'm going to share my screen.
Okay. I'll read my little intro.
And if you could just confirm, are you seeing my full screen?
Yes, you're good.
Great.
Okay. All right. Well, welcome everyone. Today's presentation is part of the Culture Builds Communities webinar series. This community-based project is designed to help Native communities plan and develop cultural facilities. Culture Builds Communities is a project of the Association of Tribal Archives, Libraries, and Museums. Major funding is provided by the Institute of Museum Services, the National Museum of the American Indian, and Margaret A. Cargill Philanthropies. All right, thank you, Sean.
Thank you. Well, it's great to be back this week and see you all again. And as I said last week, it's a tremendous honor to be a part of this incredible project. Today is the third episode in the design webinar series of Culture Builds Community. And I think for Colleen's benefit from Hopi, we can kind of talk a little bit about the whole process. So Dee Rendon, who's on the call, is an architect in Denver. He started the series off with a program on the design process. That was 2 weeks ago. Last week, I spoke on selecting and working with architects and contractors. And today, everyone gets me again. And I'll be talking about programming, and the title of the session is called Connecting Your Programming Needs with Your Building. And next week, Sam Ulbrichtson will be talking about site selection analysis and design. And the week following, he'll be talking about indigenous architecture. And then I think there's some back and forth about when the 6th webinar is, but that will be on the Contemporary Museum, and Dee will close our series out. So Colleen, as I mentioned last week, I'm a principal of AOS Architects here in Santa Fe. And we have a tremendous amount of our business is in Native communities, and I have several Native architects on staff. I myself am not, but we have a considerable experience in a variety of projects with Native communities, as well as a broader portfolio of museum projects and a particular expertise in collection storage facilities. And I've been involved with ATALM since 2013, and I've spoken at 3 or 4, at least 3 of the conferences, and have attended quite a few more. So again, hugely honored to be a part of this tremendous project. So today, we'll be talking about connecting your programming needs with your building. I'm a little bit, I've been very busy, so I haven't had a chance to get the homework and the other documents to Susan and Melissa to get uploaded on the website, but those will be there soon for you all to peruse. So today's agenda, we're gonna begin with an overview of the planning process so we can really identify when programming happens and how it relates to the other phases of work. I'm going to talk a little bit about interpretive planning and spaces for collections. And then we'll really get into the space program. I'm not talking about NASA. I'm talking about a document that is generated at the beginning of the museum design process, the museum planning process, that outlines the various spaces that you need in your building, how big they are, and how they relate to one another. Then we're going to, then there's a section of the presentation called Back to the Center, which is really about how a tribal museum is different than a normal museum. It has many of the same components, but we need to think about them in a different way. We're going to do a quick case study, and then I'm going to talk about prototyping, and then we'll have time for Q&A. So in terms of the planning process, as we talked in the last two sessions about the process, it's tremendously important community engagement in the development of a tribal museum or cultural center. And that really is the foundation of strategic planning. And Art Wolf, who's on the call, gave a couple of really great presentations a few weeks back on the importance of strategic planning, where the tribal community really nails down and documents core values, goals and objectives, priorities, understanding operations and outcomes, and how the process will be continually assessed and adjusted even once the museum is constructed. So once the strategic planning is done, most often we see projects like this go into two related, sometimes simultaneous, sometimes sequential phases of master planning and interpretive planning. Master planning is really more about the building, whereas interpretive planning is really about the exhibits. And we're going to talk a little bit about interpretive planning today as part of the programming. And this is really we like to think about it as the intellectual framework behind the exhibits. So we're not laying out the text panels of the exhibits, but we're trying to document, what are the educational objectives for the exhibits, and not just exhibits, but all the programs that will happen in your museum or cultural center. And that leads to a sound plan for exhibit concepts. And all of this is really critically important to make sure that your communities, your tribe's core values are the foundation for everything that happens in the development and construction and operation of the museum. So really, once we get past master planning and interpretive planning, often the project splits between building design and exhibit design, and both of those components have these phases of work that we talked about, or that Dee talked about at length in his initial presentation, and eventually gets you to construction. So let's talk about interpretive planning. So the process of interpretive planning is about asking questions, and it's the same kind of questions that everyone learned about when thinking about journalists. It's who, what, why, where, when, how, right? So you want to understand and really lay out a structure for the significance of the museum or the place. Why should people come here? And the interpretive themes, what will visitors learn? Who is the audience? Where in the exhibit or in the museum will different themes be interpreted? What tools will work best? So here we're talking about, a traditional object-focused exhibit or a story-focused exhibit that might use more audiovisual, or maybe it's a program that relies on a docent communicating orally in their very person as opposed to being recorded. And it goes on with evaluation and priorities. And this is really the critical foundation for any good exhibit. For tribal museums, one of the very unique aspects of them is that we have traditional knowledge that is acceptable to be shared within certain levels of the community and not others. And so it's important as you develop an interpretive plan, as you start thinking about planning a museum, to think about the levels of access. How will non-native people like myself, do they learn a different story than members of other tribes who might have a slightly deeper level of access, and tribal members from your own community would have a deeper one, and maybe there's a different way for cultural leaders to access knowledge in this facility. And this could be a matter of language. It could be a matter of actually having different rooms open to different audiences. And obviously this is something to manage, but it's a critical thing that you need to understand who the audience is. Is your facility more for your own community as a tool for cultural preservation, or is it more for external visitors? And it probably every museum is a bit of both, right? But it's critical that you understand how that's balanced in your own community. Similarly, we find and believe strongly that successful museums are intergenerational cultural centers. So we need to understand from your community the importance of these various groups, young children to youth to adults to elders, and how do we involve them in the facility? How do we make this place a tool for cultural preservation so that knowledge can be shared in its cyclical way? A place is a critically important part of interpretive planning. We talked a bit about this last week. This is a diagram from a project that Art and I worked on at Okewenge, one of the pueblos here in New Mexico. That the building itself was in some ways a way of grounding yourself in the community. It becomes a measuring device, a device to see and understand the landscape and the mountains that surround us when we're in this place. So we think about buildings not as abstract boxes, but integral pieces of the landscape itself. Once we get into interpretive planning, into the details of it, we're really talking about themes and how is the knowledge that's going to be conveyed to the visitors, how is it organized, and how can you do it in a way that conveys your community's core values and history? How does it balance the past, the present, and the future? This is the organizational diagram that was developed for the Okewenge Museum that looked at a cycle of origins into traditions, into history, into continuity. So it's about both the past and the future, and also looked at the natural cycle, the annual cycle of living in that landscape of planting, gathering, growing, and sustaining. And so there's ways to talk about culture and history and sustenance all at the same time. And then within each of those major themes, there are multiple topics to be conveyed in the exhibit and in the programming that visitors will experience. And it's really important that your tribal community finds a partner, either someone in-house or a consulting interpretive planner or exhibit designer, to help you organize this information, because it will absolutely impact the layout of the building, the configuration of the exhibit spaces, to make sure that they're large enough and they're the appropriate size and proportion and configuration to tell these really important stories. So let's talk quickly about spaces for collections. This was a slide that I very quickly flashed through last week, and I wanted to spend just a few more seconds talking about it today. So in our experience, most tribal museums and cultural centers do have a significant part of their program, part of their mission devoted towards the preservation of artifacts, whether you want to call them artifacts or objects or living members of your community. It's all the same. We need to make sure that we're stewarding them, protecting them from their future, for a better future. And so this means looking at climate change, what we call particulate and gaseous contamination. That's basically air quality. We want to make sure that the mechanical systems are keeping out and filtering chemicals and particulates, dirt, smog, that might be in the air that's brought into the building. But also we want to make sure that we're choosing the right materials in the building, so that we're not polluting the collections from the inside. So a lot of building components are actually made of pretty nasty stuff. That's getting much better with the emphasis on sustainable design and LEED. But you've heard of off-gassing and that new car smell, which everyone loves in their car, but it's actually a bad thing. That's the plastics deteriorating already, and off-gassing those chemicals. So we want to make sure that we're choosing things correctly. We need to protect things from light. Natural light can cause, especially organic materials like baskets, to fade very, very quickly. We want to protect from humidity and moisture and fire and theft and damage and so on. But we also want to make sure that we're treating these collections appropriately per your culture and the specifics of your culture. We recognize that collections often in tribal museums and cultural centers need to be fed, they need to be nourished, they need to be prayed with and for, and so it is a very different type of facility from a traditional museum. So this is just another slide about some of the technical issues in a collections environment that we need to make sure we understand as we program. We need to understand what the types of collections are and how they'll need to be stored. This is a collection storage facility that I designed at the University of Pennsylvania Museum in Philadelphia. And you see here in this the larger image that there's open shelving for baskets, there's drawers in the cabinets to the right, and open lockable cabinets in the background, and different types of textiles, baskets. All of these materials require different storage facilities. We talked about off-gassing of materials a little bit. Critically important for collection storage is understanding the load capacity, the strength of the floor to make sure it can safely and hold the weight of storage, particularly when it's in what we call compacting storage, which you see on the left, where you turn that crank and it allows a much denser, many more objects to be stored. We need to understand the types of collections that you have or want to have, and they're very real needs for specific temperature and humidity set points. And oftentimes in collection storage facility, we'll actually have different rooms with different set points because metal requires a very different environment than organics, and film requires an even different environment. And so sometimes what's best to preserve the collection as a whole does rub up against cultural protocols. And so I wanted to kind of, if you guys are interested in this subject, this is really one of the most remarkable books that I've ever read, called Preserving What is Valued, Museums, Conservation and First Nations by Miriam Clavier. Miriam is an artifact conservator from Canada working in the museum environment, and wrote this as a guide to museum conservators and tribal communities to understand these disconnects between living cultural practices and the typical kind of conservation mindset about making sure that something is absolutely protected from change, which often means put in a bag, in a box, locked away, which as we all know, for Native significant objects and cultural items, that's really inappropriate. And so this is a really remarkable book, and is part of a sea change in how tribal museum practices are understood. So this again, I just wanted to kind of quickly go through this project. This is the floor plan of that same collection storage facility at the University of Pennsylvania. And so the building is distinguished between spaces for study and care of the collections and spaces for storage. So here in blue, we see the compacting storage. The east wall of the facility is completely windowless, and it is a bronze and limestone wall. And we really wanted to make something beautiful that conveyed the importance of what was inside. And making a windowless wall, because we need to protect these collections from natural light and the damages that it can have. Making windowless walls is quite challenging. The opposite side of the building faces a garden and is full of windows and light and brick and continuing the aesthetic of the historic museum. And the way that the building is laid out is done very carefully so that the collection storage tables that we see in the lower right are at where those arrows emerge from. And so from in this room, you can look through the glass wall, through the hallway, through these other study spaces and see light. You can see clouds. You can see the changing environment. And this is not a tribal museum, but most of the collections stored in this wing are tribal items, and a lot of consultation happens here. So it was really important that we find a way to protect these artifacts and objects while allowing their living beings to thrive. So that's something important to think about as you start to begin planning a facility. Another thing to pay attention is obviously cost control. Museums are expensive. There's no way around that. And so this is an interesting exercise that we went through for a project here in New Mexico, in Albuquerque at University of New Mexico. It's a natural history collections facility. And when the university brought the project to us, they had envisioned this program. And so basically red is expensive and blue is not expensive. And it has to do with the demand on the conservation environment, the sensitivity of the mechanical systems, and the extent to which we're building the walls very robustly to be able to sustain a very tightly controlled temperature and humidity environment. So we looked at basically just the finished costs of this facility. It's about an 8,000 square foot facility, and said, well, you know, we can identify a cost per square foot for this is just the architecture, not mechanical systems, that varies from the cheapest space to the most expensive space. And the most expensive space in a facility like this is the collection storage space. And so by looking at their program, we were able to very kind of generically say, okay, that's about $1.1 million just in finishes and in structural repairs. But if we think about the facilities differently, and if we limit the collection storage, and if we limit the collections environment, we can have a way to start saving significant dollars. So this kind of analysis, by changing the conservation expectations of the various spaces, resulted in a 16.5% reduction in cost plus mechanical savings.
Sean, could you go back I wanted to take a picture of the slide right before this one, please?
Yeah. So,
okay.
and all the PowerPoints will be they're being recorded, and they are going to be posted on the website for your access. So I'll get these to Melissa this afternoon.
Thank you.
So you'll have access to all this material. These numbers are really conceptual. These are not really real numbers. So please don't rely on those. Those are square foot costs on the right. It's just, this is an idea, and every part of the country construction costs different, and those numbers fluctuate widely based on the size and complexity of any given program. So what I'm trying to convey is a concept for cost control, not the specifics of those square foot costs. So let's now, with that kind of more technical foundation, let's jump into talking about the space program. So what we're really talking about is what and how big. And there are many ways to drill into this, and we will, but I wanted to just talk in a little bit of detail on these three subjects: exhibits, collections, and culture. So for exhibits, as we set a program and work with the community to really define the space program, we really need to know these things. We need to understand your audience. And so this is going back to the interpretive plan, it's going back to the strategic plan. How many are locals and how many are visitors? And that has to, and what are their different expectations for those groups? Are they receiving a different experience? And that helps us set the space program. How many people are you anticipating? Is this meant to be a small place for people to have an intimate experience, or are we putting on blockbuster exhibitions? And our school groups coming, because they have a very specific space need for and needs, especially when you're thinking about arrival. And if they're going to be there for an extended period of time, they're going to need a place to eat lunch that might be different than a cafe. And maybe that happens outside, but we need to have these discussions. We need to understand the relationship between what everyone calls a permanent exhibit, and hopefully we can find a better word from that, because there of course should not be such a thing as a permanent exhibit, but certainly long-term, versus exhibits that are changing out more frequently. And what's the proportional relationship between those two types of exhibits that you anticipate for your facility? What's this for temporary exhibits? What's the sequencing and duration of those exhibits? We're working on a museum now here in New Mexico where they literally change exhibits every month. And that has a tremendous impact on the preparation spaces that they need, as well as the size of the galleries, because of course they can only do that with small galleries. What audio programming, visual programming are you thinking of, and what kind of orientation are you thinking of? These are, and what we really want to emphasize is the relational planning, going back to strategic planning is so critical. Getting into collections, we want to understand what your current collections are, how many, how big, what types, and where they are currently. And also bringing items home. Of course, we all understand in Native communities that many collections, many of your family members have been taken and are in other museums and basements and cabinets. And there's more and more opportunities to bring these things home, whether they be on a long-term loan or a reacquisition. One of the things that we've talked about in several facilities like this is the opportunity to create appropriate collection storage spaces for family collections in your community, so that they don't belong to the tribe or to the museum, but it's a way of allowing for cultural preservation by giving a space for families to keep their important artifacts and objects in a place that they'll be well cared for. So we talked before that we sometimes need to segregate by materiality. So things that are made of metal probably shouldn't be in the same room as things that are baskets. And of course, that's an ideal scenario. And there's many things where one artifact has both, and we're obviously not recommending to take them apart and store them separately. So I mentioned before the idea of having a space for nourishing the collections, feeding them. Many museums are allowing cultural leaders to come in and do blessings and leave cornmeal or other natural things that are necessary for these cultural practices. And that's very counter to a traditional collections facility, but something that's very important and real and necessary in a tribal facility. And also, many of these collections need to be used. They need to continue to be used even when in storage in some ways. And so what kind of space is needed for that? In terms of culture, we're talking about really the present day. So features like a language lab. The Okewenge Museum that we planned has the goal of establishing a radio station in the facility so that they can best preserve the Tewa language over the airwaves. A dance studio, art classrooms, gardens, community kitchen, music, song. These are all things that are not very standard in a typical museum, but might be really critical in your museum. So what we're really talking about is the balancing that's going to be unique to each tribe of objects and stories, and how the past and future come together. And what we're really often getting at is this interesting intersection between the preservation of and the production of knowledge. So how does your facility steward materials from the past, but also how is it involved in the very current and very active production of knowledge through the safeguarding of culture and the conveyance of that culture to your youth. So now we're going to get into the different types of needs of a space program and how you start to make sense of this. This can be very complicated. So of course, the first thing when many people think of a museum is the galleries, the exhibits, the collection storage and collections care facility, but also there's things like a cafe, an event space, classrooms, kitchen, meeting space, lobby, gift shop, restrooms, and then things that people don't often think about, so I've made them hard to read: storage, crating, loading, mechanical, electrical rooms, administration space. So how you've got all these needs and they're going to be different for each one of your communities. How do you make sense of this? How do you start to organize this and understand how big these spaces are? The first thing that we do as architects and planners is start to understand how we sort them. And we sort them often in the first exercise by public, semi-public, and private. And so the public spaces are those rooms in your facility that you're inviting the public into. The exhibits, the lobby, the restrooms, the cafe, etc. Semi-public are rooms that visitors sometimes can come into, but often not. And so those are more some of the administrative space, classrooms, meeting space. So they might be kind of around the corner, but it depends on your museum. And then there's typically things that are private spaces where visitors are rarely admitted, the collection storage, collection care, although many indigenous museums have flipped that on its head in wonderful ways, but certainly, and then spaces like storage, crating, loading, mechanical. So that's the first way of organizing. And then we like to look at how we can continue to organize these according to environmental controls. And this gets back to the idea of temperature and humidity. And what most native arts collections are primarily organic materials, right? Baskets, earth, textiles. And they really, to maintain those items as best as possible, they need very strict temperature and humidity controls. Typically, we're talking about 70 degrees temperature plus or minus 2, maybe 5, and somewhere between 30 and 50% humidity, depending on what you're storing. And again, plus or minus 5 degrees. So in a typical mechanical system cannot provide that very fine level of segregation. So it's really important those things that are now have shifted to the right side of the screen, the galleries and the collection storage space, that those have the strictest level of environmental control. Places like the lobby, the gift shop, general storage, classrooms, administrative spaces, those are much more flexible in their environmental controls. And depending on the size of your facility, if it's a facility is very small, it will be more cost effective to have one mechanical system that provides the strict level of environment for the whole facility. But if your facility is very large, it'll be more cost effective to start to segregate your program so that you can have multiple mechanical systems and limit the expensive strict mechanical systems just to what is necessary. So then we start to look at how big these things are, and all of these components of the building are fluctuating in size, and we start thinking about how do we arrange them, and we put them in different or test different arrangements. The specifics of this aren't important, but I think you all can see, and often we will work with the community. We'll cut up pieces of paper and everyone will, like a puzzle, and kind of shift them around. We'll talk about the pros and cons and the beneficial adjacencies is what we call this. And so this is kind of in this kind of generic museum that I've laid out for you today, is kind of where we've landed in a way that situates the programmatic spaces of the museum in a way that allows for a logical organization of spaces by both public, private, and semi-public, as well as the environmental controls. And then we want to look at what rooms access what rooms. Just because something's next to another room doesn't mean that you can go between the classrooms and the temporary galleries. But we probably want to go between the lobby and the restrooms, right? And so that's part of this shifting around, is figuring out where are the rooms that need to be next to each other. And we usually do this in a narrative form, in a very big and complex Excel file, so that we can kind of categorize all these different rooms and who they need to be next to, and then spatial diagrams, of course, showing adjacencies. And just as important to understand how people in the ordinary operation of the building move from space to space, we need to understand as architects who are taking the life safety of the occupants of these buildings in our hands. How do people get out in an emergency? And so that definitely has an impact on how we arrange the program of the building to make sure that people can leave safely and quickly. One of the things in a museum, we talked about this a little bit last week, is the impact on natural light. And in many museums, in most museums, you will never see a window in an exhibit space, because the conservators have got us so locked up in preserving in the collections. But particularly in an indigenous museum, we want to figure out ways to catch a view of the mountain from the exhibit, and we can do that carefully, and we can control light. So we also want to understand the various spaces in terms of where natural light can be dealt with. Obviously, the lobby, the cafe, the gift shop, we can take the natural light, so let's let it in. Spaces like the administrative space, meeting rooms, classrooms, those need to be flexible. Think about a classroom where you're making a slide presentation. You want to be able to close off the light, but you also want sometimes to have light in that room. So maybe it's not a good idea that we've buried the classrooms in the middle of this building. There are certain places where we really don't want natural light, collection storage and temporary galleries. But as I showed in that example earlier, there are ways that we can still protect collections from the damages of natural light while arranging them in such a way that you can still have a view. It's just out through a corridor or through another room. And then in the indoor event spaces, permanent galleries, collection care study, again, we need to be very careful in how we control natural light. But I do want to make sure that you're all aware that it can be done, and we can do it and provide a facility that gives these items that are being on display the cultural needs that they have, and provide a pleasant experience for your visitors. The other important thing to consider when programming and laying out the space program and the bubble diagram, as we call it, I should have said that before, is phasing. Often when we're developing a museum with a community, everyone's ambitions are usually larger than their needs. Their ambitions are larger than their ability to fundraise for. And so we need to think about phasing. And that certainly impacts how we understand the building, how we arrange it. So it's important as we develop the space program that we understand this is a critical space for when the museum opens, and this is maybe more long-term. So the building arrangement can shift so that we can develop a building that works both in its phase 1, phase 2, maybe phase 3, phase 4, and allows the facility to grow as your ability to fundraise for it. This is really important because we want to make sure that we don't lay out a building such that now our classrooms that are in the middle, those are going to have to be built in phase 1. So sometimes we'll move things into phase 1 that aren't needed if they're cheaper space, and if it makes sense in the long run of the building. Sometimes we can actually also just not do the interior finishes and just leave a blank room and lock the door. Ultimately, a lot of this is about hierarchy and control. It's about security. It's about making sure that people are behaving appropriately, and that the collections and your materials are safeguarded. Also, museums are sometimes about, and sometimes they're too much about consumption. They're too much about spending money. And we recognize that Native museums, tribal museums are important revenue sources. But you need to examine that carefully to make sure that it would actually generate revenue. And this comes back to core values of your community. And spending money and hierarchy and control, keeping people out of spaces, can very quickly run up against and be counter to your core values. And so this is part of a presentation that I've been giving at some of the recent ATOM conferences, and there's more and more talk about decolonizing the museum. And we certainly understand that the museum structure, the typical arrangement has been set up by the Western world in a way that is counter to indigenous values very frequently. It's not to say that they can't be managed together, but we want to, with every tribal museum and cultural center that we work on, we want to find ways to make sure that we're assisting your values first and foremost, and not the status quo. So let's get back to the center. Let's talk for a little bit about how to make sure that these facilities are fulfilling your core values. Now, it may very well be that your facility, the exhibits are the most important, that are intended to be the heart of your facility, even though that is more of much more of a Western way of thinking. And from those exhibits, collection storage should be adjacent to, as well as spaces for collections, care, and study. And from that central core of the exhibits, you can also access classrooms, meeting rooms, a cafe, and a kitchen. We can do this in a way that orients to your world, where the cardinal directions are respected and are incorporated into the design of the building, where views and light in each of those directions, whether they be to the compass or to mountains or to natural features that might be visible from your site, can be brought into the depth of the building. We want to make sure that we're thinking about the land and your place. And maybe from those outdoor education spaces that relate to the exhibits and to these other facilities. And then we find a way to have all these other functional needs: creating, loading, administration, restrooms, gift shop, storage. So this is a way of starting to decolonize a museum layout, to put, again, your core values and what your strategic goal, and maybe its exhibits, and how to do that in a way that respects your core values and isn't just creating a windowless box. Maybe the use of collections, the continued use of collections is most critical to your values. And so the facility might lay out somewhat differently. And maybe there's exhibits that are open to the public and exhibits that are only ever open to tribal members. So we've labeled that private exhibits here. Maybe a Native arts co-op is an essential part of how you see serving your community and creating economic revenue, not just for your tribe, but for your tribal members. Maybe a community kitchen is really the heart of your museum. My favorite part about the National Museum of the American Indian in Washington is that fabulous restaurant and the experience, the deep cultural experience that we can have there by the act of sharing a meal. And so how might your facility arrange itself with a community kitchen at the heart? How does that change the program in terms of having a kitchen at the center of the facility, having more spaces to have classrooms and meeting rooms and to teach traditional cooking, but also have exhibits about food and culture and eating and how that relates to the natural world. Maybe this all means that the gift shop is more of a cafe and a facility for takeout food. So you start to see that how these facilities could be modified to adjust to your strategic plan. Maybe community education is the heart, and exhibits are actually somewhat a more minor role of your museum, because maybe your museum is more about stories and conveyance of culture through language. So this is where that maybe a radio station, a language lab, maybe there's an artist in residence and music and dance facilities, but it's here we have a facility that's more future oriented rather than historically oriented. It's less about objects and things rather than the oral tradition, and making sure that tradition is safeguarded deep into the future. So these are just some ideas about how the program really needs to respond to your specific culture. So I wanted to quickly get into a case study about the Okewinge Museum here in New Mexico. So we went through this kind of standard process of understanding all of the bits and pieces that you see on the right, the program. So I know this is a little fuzzy and hard to read, I apologize. But you see that the spaces are organized by private, semi-public, public. The sizes of the spaces, the general configuration has been figured out for how many people they want to have in the auditorium. And then on the left is showing the way that we started to kind of look at how these rooms relate to each other, how you access one room from the next. Here we have an early diagram from Okewinge on the left, showing how the programmatic spaces, how that space program can be arranged to tell a story, to allow visitors to go on a journey as they go through the building. And so that interpretive plan, that structure of what we want people to learn, how we want them to learn it, and in what sequence is critically important to the design of the museum as visitors move through the space in a clockwise fashion, which is how the village at Owenebukbinge, the middle heart place of Okewinge, is organized. And that starts to take form through rough sketches. And here we see some kind of early napkin noodling of how these spaces might come together. One study looked at the ability to allow that the center heart of the building, which in this case is exhibits, but have those view sheds to their four sacred mountains in each direction, not necessarily the cardinal directions, but close. And then the final plan, the way that it was configured, looks at bringing people into the building, that the journey of the visitor as a critical part that impacted how the building was laid out, so that you actually come down a ramp and come down into the earth a little bit to come into the lobby, and then into the orientation gallery, and finally into the permanent gallery in the center of the facility, where the interpretive plan of the seasonal cycle of knowledge that I showed you some slides back, and that interpretive organization diagram where those stories will be conveyed. So I wanted to talk very quickly, and we're nearing the end, about prototyping. One of the activities that Sam, Dee, and I are very excited about, that we'll begin to start working with you on, is conceptual designs and diagramming for your museums. And we're not necessarily going to develop 9 different concepts, but look at your different cultures and what is shared, and how we might develop models for tribal museums that can be somewhat replicable but also unique. And that's a really interesting dilemma of how can something be replicated while allowing for the uniqueness of a given culture. So we want to obviously avoid the cookie cutter and develop a system for tribal museums, organizing tribal museums that can be adjusted and fine-tuned. So I just kind of been thinking about this and put a few diagrams and thinking about a very simple partie diagram that has a gathering space in the middle of the facility, much like the magnificent rotunda at NMAI in Washington. But of course, we're not going to be replicating NMAI across the country, and this is a very different scale. But a room where culture can be preserved, that's surrounded by education, exhibits, collections, and then very necessary administrative spaces. And so there's a way of thinking about a structuring of such a facility in which, in different communities, each of these spaces might take on different, greater prominences. And so this is just something that's starting to gel in my brain, and I think an exciting thing that we can continue to talk about as this program develops further on. So what in your different communities, how might such a structure be fine-tuned for your particular tribe? And that is what I have prepared. And next week, we're gonna have Sam talking to us about site selection, analysis, and design. And I'm gonna stop sharing my screen and look forward to a good discussion.
Okay, so what kind of questions do we have for Sean?
This is Jessica. I just want to say that was a spectacular presentation, Sean. And
thank you.
Yeah, as you know, I was taking some photos, but it was, I can't wait to share those ideas with our tribal council and our planning committee, because you did such a good job of explaining it and showing the different ways that we might be able to envision the spaces connecting and what's most important. So thank you so much for really enlightening me on the so many opportunities and ways of discussing it in our community.
You're quite welcome. I'm really excited to continue these discussions, and I think the organization of this that Susan and Melissa have set up is really quite wonderful. It allows us to have these focused dives into aspects of the design process, and it's only going to get better from here on out with Sam and Dee bringing it home through the rest of the process.
I have a question. So I was looking when you just in all your diagrams, you're showing specific spaces, and I've known there's a lot of different ways to design museum spaces or cultural centers. How does the design affected when you decide to use one space for different purposes? So like an example would be
Sure.
like a permanent exhibit space could have movable walls, so you can adjust the space size to accommodate to have permanent exhibits and temporary exhibits, or even like turn part of it into like classroom activity rooms. How
Right.
does that affect your overall design? And would you advise that, or
Absolutely.
are there pros and cons about it?
Yes, and yes, and yes. Dollars are scarce. And so we want all buildings that we design to be able to be nimble. And you have one idea of how a building's going to work as you're planning it, and once you get into operating it, we want to make sure that it's that can be changed. And so that's one of the dilemmas of designing a building so tightly to a set of cultural values. I think the facility that we've laid out for OK Wingay, I think that's certainly a fair criticism of that floor plan, because it's so specific, and it would be very difficult to adjust and to have more classroom space and less exhibit space. So that's certainly something to think through. One of the dilemmas with multifunction spaces is the conservation environment. I think we can all understand why we don't want in a standard museum, you wouldn't want school group bringing their lunches into the room, where the Mona Lisa is on display, because the food brings pests. And so there are definitely are real challenges to the ultimate multifunction room, but we certainly understand that tribal museums are really a different a different thing, that we need to make sure that those cultural practices are understood and are allowed, and that there are ways of safeguarding collections and being appropriate stewards for the knowledge that's embedded in those collections, to make sure that they're there for our descendants. But it's something that will be unique to each institution, and it's a very excellent point. I know I've kind of answered the question by not answering the question.
Hey, Sean, could I add to that?
Please.
It is a great question, because when you're going through the programming and the program and building what you want in your museum or your facility, we've talked about a lot of spaces, and I was on a project that we were able to reduce the program by about 20 to 25% by overlaying similar uses on top of each other. Classrooms became craft rooms as well, by adding a sink and dealing with the floors. A theater became a place that could record both music and sound for speech, that also became a place where you could set and screen a movie. And in the back, you could have a buffet going on. So it became a family entertainment. But in order to lay on top of pieces other components that are similar, it's the same thing that Sean was describing as the program, the bubble diagram of adjacencies, but you can also do a bubble diagram of similar uses.
Yep.
So that by adding a component here or there, you don't have a room that's so specialized that it only is lit up once a week for an hour. But as long as it can be used, it's better off. So I think your point is well made, that you can have a wider, bigger program by thinking about how these pieces come together. We put in a display kitchen instead of a cafe. So there was some teaching in that, but you could also go in and there was a little alcove for vending, as opposed to having some point and place in this. And this was more for a community and less for a true museum that would cater to outside. So it really became an interesting place. Widened spaces in the corridor become meeting places. And they also become pre-function places for rooms if they're going to have community gatherings. There's a lot of ways to plan it, to look at both the rooms and the space in between the rooms. And we do call the interior rooms, and we call these outdoor spaces, sometimes we call them rooms, because they, as architects, they have critical functions to let the program expand and grow into the landscape. So I think that was a great question. And it leads to another topic that is an interesting discussion that architects talk a lot about, is designing from the inside out or the outside in.
Yep.
And inside out is your function, and outside in is your orientation, your expression, your approach. And it's two different ways, and we like to think that we've got a blend of trying to understand that. So Sean, great presentation.
Thank you, Dean.
I think it's wonderful. One more thing I'll add is, when you think of the entries to the building, please don't forget the service entry.
Yep.
Because when you do that, you want to make sure that the collections you're receiving, whether they're historical pieces or it's new artwork that's being created by the community, you want it protected, and you want to set up separations and partitions between contaminants and your products. So sometimes we forget about the different ways different components enter a building, but that's a critical one on the idea of having a functioning, working kind of project that takes care of what's coming in, both from the public and the community on the expression and the entrance and the exposure and their first experience of seeing a facility to truly the in and out of food versus dry goods.
Yeah, let me run with those things for just a little bit. I think relating to back to the multifunction spaces, we talked about adjacency, but what I didn't talk about was anti-adjacency. So we're not only are we looking for things that want to be next to each other, we're looking for things that need to be far apart from one another for exactly the kind of reasons that Dee was just talking about in terms of loading. And so that's part of how we can evaluate whether whether rooms can share multiple functions in terms of their alignment or disalignment in terms of their needs. In terms of loading and the service entrance, that is critically important. And if you are expecting to have loans from the Smithsonian, they will be looking at how collections come into the facility. They want to make sure that the collections that they're entrusted with the stewardship of are protected throughout their entire route journey from Washington or Maryland to your community. And that last leg of the journey, if off the dock of the truck into your facility, is critically important. And the American Alliance of Museums, it used to be the American Association of Museums, AAM, has a number of really helpful checklists and materials that are standardized museum reporting forms that allow lending institutions to evaluate your facility to see whether it's safe to have their collections come to you. So if you're thinking that there's a lot of temporary exhibits, or if you're wanting to bring things home from the Smithsonian or other institutions that have taken them, that's an essential part of what any museum architect needs to understand.
So I had a question about spaces that were used to take objects out of storage, to have them utilized, have them, used either in ceremony or dance, much like the Arctic Study Center or UCB, the Anthropology Museum. Does anyone here have any experience with that and experience with success in that? I understand all, part of the care of collections and understanding that, all that, while it's important, I think that it's just as important that these things like live within our lives rather than just outside of it. So does anyone have any experience in creating those spaces, and like what are things to be considered, if you want things to be regularly taken off and regularly, in Chickalum, we have our own school, and if we were to have a facility that was some sort of storage facility, that was protecting these things, how could they be regularly used in the school, regularly taken off exhibit or in storage? Yeah, does anyone have any thoughts on that?
NMAI's facility in Suitland, Maryland is spectacular. And a lot of the way that facility was laid out was along those very lines. There's places for smudging, places for burning, and very surprising facility when it opened to the museum, the standard museum world, like that they were allowing these practices. I think that's, from what I understand, that's really the kind of the gold standard. But I have not honestly had the opportunity to design a facility like that beyond the experience that I relayed at the Penn Museum, which was about kind of natural light and views.
I can speak to that a little bit. My name's Tessa, and I work at the Cultural Resources Center that you mentioned, Sean. I think that it's definitely something that there are plenty of examples, not just since our building has been built, but of ways that, Melissa, you really can accommodate the living cultural practices that are just as important as physical stewardship. And the smudge room that you mentioned, for example, Sean, we have a separate HVAC system from the rest of the building that allows us to ventilate that space independent of the rest of the museum, basically at any time with the flip of a switch on the wall, so that logistically, if someone wants to use that room, for us, we do allow collections items to be moved into that room so that they can, participate in community songs or smudging or whatever needs to happen. So I think, as long as you have thought about your collections management policies, and use cases to do that in a safe way, your building can definitely reflect that.
Thank you.
All right, do we have any more questions?
I've got one more thing to add, if I can, and Sean's talked about it, but flexibility, growth, and expansion sometimes need to be weighed in at the very, very start so that you don't put something where you don't need it later. But what's really exciting to me is to understand the stories of each place, people, place, and culture. Sometimes the activities help organize the buildings. We had one that we wanted to make sure we had public, private, and secured, similar to the features that Sean talked about. But we also had invited guests in one, and we had to walk the steps in the building from a sweat to all the procedures that would happen and the customs that would happen through, and it allowed integration deeper into the facility. So it's really interesting when you look at how the facility is used. But what I would encourage is definitely keeping a flexible mindset so that the facility can grow. The mark of a great facility, cultural or museum, is what it's like, in my opinion, as an architect after I leave and 10 years later, what it becomes, because it matures. It becomes what it needs to be in the community that it's serving. Because I think a lot of what we do as architects is we don't make the garden, we make the trellis that the garden grows on. And the garden is the culture, it's the museum, it's the stories you tell that get richer and richer as more people are emboldened to be a part of your story. And that's your community. So I hope that makes sense. But flexibility and future thinking on expansion and how the facility is used currently really help lay the foundation, the building blocks for the first steps.
Sam, did you have anything you wanted to add from your experience?
Well, I think the thing that strikes me is that, what is the role of museums, libraries, and all these facilities? It's not just a museum, but it's also a community center. It's a cultural centers. In many remote places, what we're seeing is that they want it to be kind of a building that does everything. So the idea of flexibility and the public and private separation is really important, where you can have cultural activities that are very sensitive and where you want the public to come in. So really, when you think about designing a facility, you're not just designing a building, but you're designing the community, this ability to do many things and gather and do ceremony. And so it's a much bigger thought process than just simply, okay, this is what a museum is, this is what a library is, this is what a community center is. It's because it has to be sometimes everything and nothing, and a mix of all of that.
Right. That's really great. We're working on a project right now in Santa Fe that is a cultural facility, primarily with indigenous art, and they're desperate to not be a museum. They don't want to call themselves a museum because of the cultural baggage that comes with that in our community. And it's been an amazing process to go work with them about how collections and exhibit space and education spaces are not separate rooms, but are all one and the same. And there are ways to do that. It's very complex to do that in a way that does provide for the appropriate stewardship of culture. My goal today was to kind of walk you through somewhat of a standard process and then show the conflicts with traditional communities, and how with a good process we can unpack those conflicts and turn them into opportunities and places to really have a deeper, more wonderful and sustainable conversation about conservation.
All right.
Hi. I have one more question, Melissa. So one thing that wasn't addressed, at least in the images today, was about vertical layers of a building.
Right.
And in my mind, I've always thought that we might put collections in the basement because you don't want to have light and,
Right.
you know, it might be easier. So do you have any last thoughts to share with us about maybe having offices on a second floor or collections in the basement?
Each of those raises different challenges. And one of the things that we love about the design process is working through those and how do we be as light on the land as we can be, and preserve the natural landscape and enhance the natural landscape. And obviously we do that by going up and by going down and not just sprawling as far as we can. Every site is different, and Sam will talk a lot about that next week. The challenges, I think, are fairly obvious with both. With either, there's a challenge with accessibility, which is both an important aspect of making sure that all members of your community can be throughout your facility, but also the movement of artifacts and collections through the facility. You don't want to be taking things upstairs. Collections underground raises additional concerns for moisture management through those basement walls. And depending on your environment, that can be impossible to deal with, or it might be no big deal. And also we need, you know, the geotechnical characteristics of the soil. If the bedrock is just a couple feet down, that's not going to be an option in terms of cost. Certainly having things go up is feasible, and the challenges of accessibility are there as well. Taking collections up is challenging because of the weight. Taking large spaces of assembly up is challenging because of the need to have 2 stairs down for emergency egress. And so that's one of the, it is building codes, and we know that many Native communities don't have building codes. We're ethically obligated to design, you know, maybe not to the letter of the law, but certainly to the spirit of life safety, and you would obviously want that yourself. But it can become, unless it's a big facility where you're going up already and you have multiple stairs, sometimes the cost of just, oh, let's just have that little mezzanine up there and we'll put a few staff up there. That becomes very complex in the regulatory environment that we live in today, but certainly worthy of exploration. Thank you for bringing that up.
Another thing that can place it is, and Sean, I know you can talk about this too, is the sacred nature of the collection.
Yeah.
If it truly is a sacred vault, it definitely doesn't want traffic over the top. It wants to be oriented in there or placed in the facility appropriately. And also the other thing we don't think about are the hidden dangers of causing your collection to be in some way in danger by anything that happens in the building. If it's in the low spot of the facility, floods, building damage, pipes, we definitely try to reroute any type of mechanical and services outside of those facilities in case there's pipe damage. And it causes sometimes to have 20, 30, 50% more runs of mechanical piping, but we don't want anything to happen. Lighting is another key component, and
Sprinklers.
Yeah, sprinklers or dry systems. We like to do that a lot. So there's a lot of issues, and
We could give a whole session on fire protection, Dee.
I,
Everyone would be
Hey.
so thrilled.
that'll keep everybody awake. But it is important to
Absolutely.
safety and protection of the collection.
Can I ask one more question? I'm sorry, my aunt, she had to leave a little bit early for another meeting, but she wanted me to ask you if there was going to be any discussion about sustainability. You talked a little bit about how museums kind of have a history of consumption, of spending a lot of money. You know, in what ways can we reduce that and also reduce sort of like the effect on the place? Will we be talking about that, or is there any resources before we leave that I can point her to?
Wow, there's many resources to talk through, and I certainly hope that CM&D will be talking more about sustainability in terms of green design and being light on the land as we go through the rest of this series. You know, it's certainly something to think about in the programming phase, and I think to my sense, it goes back to the question about multi-purpose and mixed use. You know, a sustainable building is as small as it can be, and that's sustainable both financially as well as ecologically. And there are some inherent conflicts in sustainability with the collections environment, because most collections facility, the mechanical systems are set to be 100% fresh air, so you're not recirculating air through collections environment, and that's one of the things in sustainable design that we start to look at is a lot of issues with mechanical systems, the extent to which we're recirculating air versus cooling and heating fresh air all the time. So that's something to think very carefully about as you work with your architect and your mechanical engineer about, you know, where do we limit, how do we balance the best conservation environment for artifact stewardship versus a more sustainable, you know, the most sustainable building is one that has no mechanical systems, right? Where we use orientation of the building, where we use natural ventilation, where to heat and cool and ventilate. That in a museum environment that can be very challenging, but there certainly are spaces in the program where that is feasible. And so it's really about setting the expectations in the same way that I had the diagram showing, here's where we can deal with natural light and here's where we can't. To think about that space by space, both mechanically as well as from a materials selection. There's an extraordinary conversation going on right now in the architectural industry about embodied carbon in construction materials. Concrete and steel are among the most environmentally unfriendly materials that mankind has ever built with. So how do we and indigenous communities, who else could lead the way about ways to construct buildings from the very earth, from our natural materials. But again, how do we balance that with a facility that can maintain an environment that is necessary for collections? These are really complex, complicated, and I find very exciting questions to work through with communities.
Hey, Sean, I do find that the first question I have is, what does sustainability mean to you? Because it's portrayed in various ways. I personally have the credentials of LEED A, P, B, D, and C, which is a system, but and it requires filling out forms and meeting certain metrics. But is that really what's sustainable? One of the most unsustainable parts of our world, and Sean alluded to this, is construction. So there's another process you look at of life cycle costs. It's not the first cost that comes in, the building cost, but it's using quality materials that you don't have to build only to repair or rebuild later, that you have a life cycle that's 50 to 100 years because of the quality of materials you're talking about. Sean talked about concrete, but some of the Roman viaducts are still up. They haven't had to rebuild them in 2,000 years. That's pretty cool. And sometimes quality materials transfer the whole energy matrix to where you're talking about thermal lag instead of creating a hermetically sealed structure that's trying to fight against solar gain. It actually uses solar gain to the benefit of the facility, where it's heating in the off hours and cooling in the other hours during the day hours. So there's a lot of things to do, and lighting is a big part of it. Orientation, but it really is, what is sustainability to you, your region, what's important to you, and I think that has to be established right up front of from the outset of what are the goals of the project that Sean's been talking about. So I think that's a good question for everybody to come back with at some point and say, what is your level of sustainability? What would you like to do? There's another concept called cradle to grave and cradle to cradle, and it's a life cycle of materials that either keep working for you or they have a lifespan that is something that works for the project. So I hope that wasn't too long of a response.
Thank you, Janan.
Great.
All right, any other questions?
I want to make a comment. No questions. I've got a lot to absorb here with all this information. Sean, thank you for that. Very
welcome.
Resourceful, because in our position, we don't have any of that. Go and take it. You know, we're really like ground up, you know, and we're trying to make this work, but there's a lot of information to process for my people, my administration, my council members.
We're losing you, Lillian.
Yep. Oops, I think she froze up. All right, well, I think she might have frozen. We're good. All right, do we have any other questions? All right, if not, thank you so much, Sean and Dee, and for everything today. It was a wonderful presentation, and we will see everyone next Wednesday.
Looking forward to it.
Next Monday, you guys. All right, see you.
Great.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, Sean. Oh. Hi.
Put me on speaker. There you go.
Yeah. How do I end this?
Oh, you have to click end meeting.
End meeting. Where would that be?
Down there in the right-hand corner, probably.
Oh, end meeting.
There.
Okay. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you for joining us. We'll see you
Thank
next week, Lillian.
Okay.
Okay. Take care of yourself.
You too.
Okay.
Stay
Bye-bye.
safe.